Welcome to Best Evidence. I'm John Titus. This is the week that the Federal Open Market Committee meets to decide whether to raise interest rates. Supposedly. If you've ever read an FOMC transcript, you know that the only thing the committee actually decides is how to tweak a press release. The rest of the meeting is an idle discussion of policies that are handed down to FOMC members, who function as Wall Street secretaries. Today's film is about the June 2009 meeting. Basically, the Fed has been wrecking the economy for the last 6 years, and it doesn't care. Its only real job is to prop up a handful of bankers who steal trillions of dollars from the rest of us. That's really all there is to it. If you doubt me about the secretary part, take a look at page 165 of the transcript. There is a 35-page discussion of how to massage a pre-existing press release. So if your only job is to massage a couple of paragraphs and send it to the printer, you're a secretary. End of story. The twisted reality here is that the people calling the shots are stealing money by hiding behind the Fed's skirt and claiming independence. You see how that works? Criminals are running the Federal Reserve and using it as both a sword to steal money and a shield to conceal their crimes. That's it. Want to know what an audit would look like? Here you go. The tip of an iceberg. Nowhere is the harm being done to Main Street by government-approved Wall Street fraud any more glaring than it is in bank lending. From 1984 until September of 2008, lending followed a simple pattern. Every dollar brought in by depositors through the front door got lent out to borrowers through the back door. That ended abruptly in October of 2008, when banks began drastically cutting back loans, even though deposits kept rising. By May of 2015, the gap between lending and deposits was $2.5 trillion, which is substantially larger than the entire gross domestic product of Italy. Today, for every dollar they get in deposits, banks lend out just 75 cents. This lending gap started at exactly the same time the U.S. Federal Reserve started paying banks interest to hold excess reserves. Excess reserves are simply funds held at the Fed over and above the minimum that banks are required to keep as backup for deposits. Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke explained the link between excess reserves and lending in February of 2009, just 4 months after the Fed's new interest-paying policy became effective.
Importantly, the management of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet and the conduct of monetary policy in the future will be made easier by the recent congressional action to give the Fed authority to pay interest on bank reserves. Because banks should be unwilling to lend reserves at a rate lower than what they can receive from the Fed, the interest rate the Fed pays on bank reserves should help to set a floor on the overnight interest rate.
That the explosion in excess reserves has an equal and opposite echo in reduced lending is one of the more breathtaking phenomena of the bailout era, curiously ignored by all financial media, and yet here it is. From 1984 until late 2008, the Federal Reserve didn't pay interest on excess reserves, and banks didn't hold any. Over that same period, the lending gap, deposits minus loans, likewise hovered around zero. But the day the Fed stepped into the shoes of Main Street borrowers by paying interest to the banks, excess reserves skyrocketed, hitting $2.49 trillion by May of 2015. The lending gap followed suit in perfect tandem, hitting $2.48 trillion the same month. In theory, this wasn't supposed to happen, at least not for this long. The Fed said its rash of post-crisis programs, such as interest payments on excess reserves, were only temporary fixes needed to help the alleged recovery.
As we consider new programs or the expansion of old ones, the Federal Reserve will carefully weigh the implications for our exit strategy, and we will take all necessary actions to ensure that the unwinding of our programs is accomplished in a smooth and timely way.
That was 2009. And yet excess reserves show no sign of leaving the stage. This is not an accident. As we shall see, the Fed never planned to unwind these programs, which conceal Wall Street theft that is unprecedented in scale. So committed is the Federal Reserve to this criminal remit that it has knowingly affected, for 6 years, the same anti-lending policy from the late 1930s that extended the Great Depression into the teeth of World War. The most accurate public records of deliberations inside the Federal Reserve are transcripts and slides from its open market committee meetings held several times a year. These are on the Fed's website. The most recent year available is 2009. That's because the Fed conceals these records for over 5 years before their release. Throughout 2009, far and away the most dominant topic at meetings was just how radically the Fed planned to expand its balance sheet, and how it would shrink the balance sheet back to normal size once expansion stopped. In the June 2009 meeting, these topics get teed up early on page 4 of the 200-page transcript. To track what's going on, it's essential to look at the visuals driving the discussion. The most relevant slides here are Exhibits 2 and 3, the Fed's projections for its balance sheet into the future. With fully 70 Fed members in attendance, Chairman Bernanke all but dispensed with preliminaries in getting down to brass tacks. The 2-day meeting would center on the Fed's balance sheet, reserve management, and exit strategy. All 3 concepts are reflected in Exhibit 2. The balance sheet shows the push-pull relationship between assets and liabilities, which match each other dollar for dollar at every point in time. The shapes of green assets and red liabilities are thus always identical. For the most part, these figures represent the Fed's conjecture about the future. The dark regions, however, are data that had already been collected through May of 2009, the last full calendar month before the meeting. Exhibit 2 sets forth the Fed's baseline projections, under which the balance sheet would peak quickly at slightly less than $3 trillion and then shrink over the course of several years. Bernanke's timely exit is shown here by the long downtrend beginning at the end of 2009. The Fed's expanded projections, which turned out to be more accurate, are on the next slide. On the liability side, the dominant component highlighted in yellow is total reserve balances, which includes both excess and required reserves. According to the Fed's plan, total reserves would start shrinking at the end of 2009. The dotted line represents the Fed's projections for total reserves from May 2009 forward. This money, which is a liability on the Fed's balance sheet, is an asset on the balance sheets of the banks keeping that money at the Fed. According to the Fed's plan, total reserves would ramp up throughout 2009. They were supposed to peak at $2 trillion, several multiples above their historical average, after which they were supposed to decline steadily back down to normal levels. By May of 2015, the Fed projected reserves would be back under $500 billion. Reality, however, has made a cruel mockery of Bernanke's smooth and timely exit. Far from dipping below $500 billion, total reserves have in fact exceeded $2.5 trillion. And what led to Bernanke's 500+% error? The answer is excess reserves, which exploded from less than 1% to well over 90% of total reserves. It is these oceans of cash that have washed into bank vaults and drowned U.S. lending. Having hobbled the Main Street economy, the Fed now goes to astonishing lengths trying to explain away the Frankenstein that it's created. As one release earlier this year had it, why are U.S. banks holding the liquidity being pumped into the economy by the Federal Reserve as excess reserves instead of making more loans? A more honest question would be, why not eliminate interest on excess reserves and revive lending to ordinary businesses? Nevertheless, the historical parallel found by the Fed is refreshingly candid. The Fed not only admits that it's to blame for deepening and extending the Great Depression in the late 1930s, but that it did so with a policy that produced exactly the same crushing side effect that's at work right now, and that's reduced bank lending. Back then, the Fed required higher reserves, whereas since 2008, it's induced the total higher by paying interest on all reserves. The result, dramatically reduced lending, is the same either way. By immobilizing bank reserves, whether through the carrot of interest payments or the stick of regulation, the Fed is repeating the disaster it admittedly caused during the Great Depression. Any change from then to now is a distinction without a difference. Be all of this as it may, The Fed's scheme of guaranteed interest payments explains only why banks hold such massive excess reserves. What it does not account for is where the banks got $2.5 trillion in the first place. After all, these banks were so broke in 2008 that a $700 billion tax bailout wasn't enough to save them. The answer to this $2.5 trillion riddle sits on the other side of the balance sheet, which reflects the so-called assets that otherwise broke financial institutions sold to the Fed. The two biggest assets are U.S. Treasuries and agency MBS. Treasuries are just IOUs written by the U.S. government to finance deficit spending. Agency MBS, on the other hand, refers to mortgage-backed securities created by Wall Street. The latter were sold until even the most clueless investors finally got wise. Once that happened, and the 2008 meltdown ensued, Wall Street dumped the toxic remainder into its corrupt puppet agencies like Fannie Mae, thus avoiding the fatal losses that open market sales would have brought. As of the June 2009 meeting, the Fed held $580 billion in treasuries and $420 billion in mortgage-backed securities. The Fed's plan was to massively ramp up purchases of both asset classes through 2009, and to gradually get rid of them over the next several years. The Fed projected that by May of 2015, it would hold $860 billion in mortgage-backed securities and $750 billion in U.S. Treasuries. What the Fed did in reality dwarfed its own projections. By May of 2015, the Federal Reserve in fact held $2.46 trillion rather than $750 billion in U.S. Treasuries. Likewise, the Fed's actual purchases of $1,730 billion in mortgage-backed securities was upwards of $1 trillion more than its $860 billion projection for May of 2015. And in both cases, the Fed is yet to start unloading assets, despite Bernanke's representation of a timely exit. The reason the Federal Reserve hasn't sold off any of these assets is apparent from the wholesale absence, throughout the 200-page transcript, of any actual plan to unwind its massive asset purchases. There was never an exit plan at all. The omission of exit strategies, from a meeting devoted to exit strategies, was such a glaring contradiction that Fed members complained at length. From page 41, concerning large-scale asset purchases, we still have this line showing our holdings going up, and the only thing is how we are going to adjust the line going up, but that is not an exit strategy. Another Fed member pointed out that simply knowing assets would have to be sold eventually is a far cry from knowing how to sell them. I expected to see more about what we could do to reduce our holdings, and all I see is that we're going to have to sell. The Fed's all-out obsession with buying assets, in volumes that would smash every record in financial history, done without even a clue as to how those purchases might be reversed, is condemned sardonically by James Bullard. So we're not really exiting from that increase in the base. We're just saying we're going to more than double the monetary base, and we're going to see what happens. In fact, the only plan the Fed ever had once the assets were purchased was to trick the public into believing that it had some plan to sell them. I think we need to convince them that we have an exit strategy and that we are prepared to execute it in a timely way. This sort of utterance, brightly flowered deceptions on a full stem of premeditation, used to be enough to make even rent-a-cops suspicious. The obvious suspect here is mortgage-backed securities, and not far beneath the surface, the Federal Reserve's role as an accessory after the fact to one of the biggest financial crimes of all time is as clear as day. The New York Fed maintains a spreadsheet of all mortgage-backed securities bought by the Federal Reserve. In the heavy majority of transactions, the Fed paid over 100 cents on the dollar. The Fed paid $1 and change even though the crisis of 2008 had sent prices, which were sitting at a few pennies on the dollar to begin with, through the floor. In the summer of 2008, for example, Merrill Lynch sold mortgage-backed securities, having a face value of $31 billion, and got just 5.4 cents in the dollar for them, Merrill was lucky to pull even that nickel out from under the crisis, which steamrolled by less than 2 months later. It wasn't until more than a year later that analysts discovered why MBS valuations were essentially zero. It turns out that the investment banks putting together MBS products did so fraudulently, often selling mortgages that hadn't originated yet, if ever. Bankers at these institutions, in acts of blatant criminality, then sold mortgage-backed securities that weren't backed by any mortgages or promissory notes at all.
There's a big question as to exactly what notes got conveyed where and what didn't. For those trusts that are empty, the fraud is much more severe because essentially the money was stolen, all of it.
None of the deals done by Countrywide had been done correctly. So it was 100% fail on Countrywide deals. And of the other deals, there was a 2/3 failure. The 2/3 of them hadn't been handled correctly.
See, the trust paid good money to somebody up the line for that note. If it never got it, well, then they got ripped off.
I suspect that the promissory notes are still, like Countrywide, in many cases with the originators, and that nobody wants to admit they're with the originators because it basically meant that the originators took the money fraudulently.
All told, the Federal Reserve has printed $1.73 trillion and handed it over in exchange for worthless assets, which have been sitting at the Fed, shielded from prying eyes, for 6 years. The only use for these papers now is as exhibits in criminal prosecutions. This is why the Fed never planned to part with these so-called assets, and never will. Tellingly, various meeting participants called out the Fed's entire rationale for buying MBS, lower yields, as abject nonsense. Jeffrey Lacker was downright blunt. We could be buying peanuts and Cracker Jacks, and it would drive yields down. Fed officials were concerned that the Federal Reserve's role as a criminal welfare agency would become blatantly apparent when it doled out trillions of dollars for ballpark junk food. I think we have to be very careful that we're not perceived as basically providing facilities to prop up institutions that are too big to fail at the expense of other institutions that desire to grow. While it's clear who's benefiting from this racket, the victims are less obvious. That's because they're so spread out over both new and existing businesses. For alarming percentages of them, and thus for the U.S. economy, it's been lights out for years. The birth rate of new businesses, those likeliest to need loans, was trending down before the Fed bludgeoned lending with a $2 trillion bag of peanuts and Cracker Jacks. Moreover, the death rate for existing businesses has spiked above the new business birth rate for the first time ever. This is a coffin for the U.S. economy, an expanding population trapped in a box of jobs that is shrinking. More disturbing still is that top Fed officials have known from the start that the lending implosion during the 30s resulted from remarkably similar policies to today. This topic comes up repeatedly in the June 2009 meeting, but the plan never changes. To Ben Bernanke and the other clerks minding the Fed, the Second Depression is a source for jokes. Jeff Lacker: we tried increasing reserve requirements when excess reserve holdings were really large once in the late 1930s, and it didn't turn out so well. Ben Bernanke: it did sop up the excess reserves, though. This was all predicted, to the letter, when the Federal Reserve was first conceived as the National Reserve Association in 1910. It's taken a century for the Fed to destroy nearly everything, and for America to learn nothing.
Shows